Morning, good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Be there in a minute.
With the help of Hashem, we are learning Masechtas Chagiga, which will also be the final Masechta in Seder Moyed, as we spoke out in the last year of Masechtas Moyed Katan. Tosfos brings those who had Moyed Katan as the final Masechta of the order of Moyed, which at first glance would make more sense because Moyed means the cycle of life. And I know that Moed Katan spoke in the beginning a lot about Chala Moed, but Moed Katan spoke a lot about end of life. So the end of the cycle of life is the siyum of Seder Moed. Our Seder is that Chagiga is going to be the final Masechta of the order of Moed. And interestingly, Chagiga will speak about two topics. The two topics where we don't have that much initial pleasure and fire in, and we have to develop that. Chagiga, first half of Chagiga until Daf Yud Ches speaks about Kachim. We're going to be learning about the karbanos that we are obligated to bring when we fulfill the mitzvah of Re'iyah, which means that when we appear in the Beis HaMikdash, as we are obligated to appear 3 times a year, at least during the 3 regalim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, we have to bring with us a korban oilas re'iyah, as we'll speak out more details. We have to bring with us a korban shalmei chagiga, and also if we don't have any other sacrificial meat to eat, if we ran out of the shalmei chagiga meat, then we're obligated because of the samachta b'chageka to bring shalmei simcha, as we'll learn details. So we will basically be learning dinim, halachas of kachim, and then from Daf Yud Ches until the end of the Masechta, we're going to be learning about taharas. Taharas is the order in Talmud Bavli in which there's very little Gemara. And so what's the logic of placing kachim and taharas at the end of Seder Moed? Very easy. As we have the famous Rav Pinchas ben Yair recorded in Avodah Zarah Daf Chav Amud Beis and in other places, the different steps beginning with Torah, that Torah brings a person to Zechirus, that brings a person to Zerizus. Ultimately, that's going to bring a person to Tahara. And Tahara, there are many steps that we're skipping, will ultimately lead us to Ruach HaKodesh, which will lead us to Tchias HaMeisim. So actually, since Taharas leads us to Ruach HaKodesh, which leads us to Tchias HaMeisim, for a Yid, the end of the cycle of life is life. Not the end of cycle of life is the end of life. And on that note, I would like to dedicate the entire Masechtas Chagiga over the last very short amount of time here in Chabad Solo. We had 3 families that underwent real loss. So first of all, we're dedicating Masechtas Chagiga Le'ilu Nishmas Miriam Bas Mordechai Moshe Aaron. That's Miriam Slotowitz. We're dedicating this Masechta Le'ilu Nishmas Tzvika's mother, Tzipoida Bas Arya Halevi. We're dedicating Masechtas Chagiga to Shloima's father, Moshe Aaron ben Ezriel Halevi. May their neshamas have an aliyah, but let's come to the siyum of it all. The siyum of Moed is that there's going to be a Tchias HaMeisim. So it's not only Bila Hamavas Lanetzach, as we learned in the last Mishnah, that Veidaran explains that from Mikanu Lahaba, there won't be death, but it's more than that. It is that those that passed away, they will be coming back, and may we witness that now. Amen. Amen. So aside of the intro about the 3 unique sacrifices that the men who are obligated to go to the Beis HaMikdash must bring when they come there. Again, the Oilas Re'iyah, the Shalmei Chagiga, and the Shalmei Simcha, as we will speak more pratim. We're going to begin the Masechta by learning about those individuals who are exempted from the mitzvah of Re'iyah. And even if they appear, they don't have to come with these sacrifices. We will see who they are and why do they have such an exemption. We're going to be touching upon the famous Chatzi Evet, Chatzi Ben Choyren. There is a phenomena of an Evet Kanani of a person, not a person who was kidnapped and sold into slavery, which is morally terrible, which is outlawed in the Ten Commandments, but there is a phenomenon of a person being allowed to sell themselves. And parenthetically, many people will tell you that their current parnasa is one in which they're not doing something that they enjoy doing, but for money, to make a living, that they subject themselves willingly to certain work conditions. So there's a concept of a person making a one-time deal, and they, so to say, sell themselves into slavery. If the owner of such an eved is a yid, part of the process is that eved has to go to the mikvah. They don't go into the mikvah to become a Jew, but they go into the mikvah l'shem avdus, and they become, to a certain degree, like a Jew. They are obligated to keep all of the negative mitzvahs in the Torah. They are also in some positive mitzvahs, they also have a shaykhs to. That's an Eved Kanani. Now, there's a possibility that such a person should become half free. For example, the father owned an Eved Kanani. The father passes away. He has two sons. One of them emancipated the Eved, but one of the sons only owns half of the Eved. Or two partners own an Eved and one frees the Eved. That person is called a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Chayden. We're going to be touching upon the halachic status of such a person, obviously linked to whether is that person obligated to go to the Beis HaMikdash, or whether that person is exempt from going to the Beis HaMikdash, appearing during the 3 Regalim with the Karbanis. Why would they be exempt? Because an Eved Kanani, very similar to the laws of women, they are exempt from keeping positive mitzvahs that are time-bound. They can opt in, but they're not obligated to keep it. So we're going to figure out whether a Chatzi Evet, Chatzi Ben Chayden has the status of someone that's mechuyev, or whether or not there's going to be a phenomenal machlokes b'Shamai and b'Hillel, and we will also be speaking about the halachic status of a chedesh. Now, I want you to know that the word chedesh can have many meanings. It can mean a deaf mute. It can mean someone who's only deaf. Someone who's only mute at times is called an elaim, but there are other times that that person will also be called a chedesh. What's this thing about a chedesh? As we will see, people that are halachically considered mentally underdeveloped are people that are exempt from the obligations of keeping the mitzvahs. In the times of Chazal, a deaf mute did not develop. We're going to speak about the current halachic poskim, which debate how would we define a chedesh nowadays, because there were many advances that we have in the world, and we know how to communicate, and we also know how to allow a chedesh communicate with us. And the moment there's communication, there is mental development, and according to most halachic poskim, today we don't have the halachic chedesh. But just that we're going to be speaking about, when the Mishnah is speaking about a chedesh, is it the deaf mute, or only the deaf, or only the mute, and many other details. Without any further ado, let us start on Daf Beis Amud Aleph, beginning with the Mishnah. It says the Mishnah, Hakoil Chayovin B'Re'iyah. Everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah. Re'iyah literally means to see. Re'iyah means to appear in the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year, as it says many times in the Chumash. All right. And together with the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash comes along the mitzvah of bringing a korban oila, which is called an oilas re'iyah. It's a sacrifice that's fully burnt on the altar. None of it is eaten, not only by the owner, not even by the kaihanim. And also to bring a korban shalmei chagiga. Shalmei chagiga means a korban shlamim. It's a different category of sacrifice. It's offered on the altar. Some of it then is given to the kaihanim. Other parts of that sacrifice will be given to its owners, who may eat it anywhere in Yerushalayim for a limited prescribed amount of time. Once that meat runs out, if that meat runs out, and it's going to run out because you can only eat it for 2 days and 1 night, throughout Yom Tov, not Shavuos, which is a 1 day, but Pesach, throughout Sukkot, there was also an obligation, v'samachta b'chagecha, which means beginning with celebrating, rejoicing by eating sacrificial meat on Yom Tov. It doesn't only mean that. It means even when there's no Beis HaMikdash yet, that we're supposed to eat meat and drink wine on Yom Tov. It means that women have to celebrate by their husbands buying for them new garments and jewelry, v'chulei. But the beginning of mitzvah simcha halachically is eating sacrificial meat. So the moment you run out of shalmei chagiga, you have to bring shalmei simcha. These are the three general korbanis. We're going to speak a lot about them. When the Mishnah says you're chayiv and re'iyah, Rashi writes, the first Rashi, the mitzvah re'iyah, the mitzvah of appearing, and he quotes a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim from the many psukim, where it says, right, really, Yeroah, kol zechurcha. This is an obligation only on men because this is a time-bound mitzvah. Many women went up there, but like many other mitzvahs that they're not obligated to keep, but they can opt in. Tosfos, the first Tosfos, has a problem with the superficial understanding of Rashi, which is that the Mishnah is only referring to the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis Hamikdash. Tosfos concludes, I'm going to the middle of the Tosfos, Al Kain Nira l'Rabbeinu Tam, the Masnisan Maide Bikarben Uba Azara. And actually, the Rabbeinu Tam says that's what Rashi means. We're dealing with two mitzvahs that are linked one with the other. There is a mitzvah to appear. The Torah says, you can't appear empty-handed. Actually, there are those who opine that if someone appears in the Beis Hamikdash and they don't bring the sacrifices, they're doing a mitzvah haba ba'aveda. There's a whole discussion whether we actually view it that way or not. Bottom line is that let's approach, the Mishnah is dealing with mitzvahs that are linked, but it's not only one mitzvah. Re'iyah means appearing, herst, and re'iyah means appearing with the karbanos, for the mitzvah to be done in a wholesome fashion. Everyone is obligated to appear, aside of the first three are people who are defined halachically as people that are mentally not fully developed. Therefore, they're not obligated to keep the mitzvahs. Who will that be? The first one will be aside of the chedesh, again, the deaf and mute, both challenges. Then was certainly considered the person who's not developed. Shoita means a deranged person. This has to be defined. How do you define a deranged person? It's just to point out one thing, that the definition of a shoita is not consistent throughout Shas. What will be considered a shoita regarding one area of halacha won't necessarily always be the definition of a shoita in other areas of halacha. But at least let's get familiar with the concepts that if a person is considered deranged, mentally not well, they are exempt from the obligations of the Torah and the katan and a minor. A minor is not deranged, but a minor is someone who is, the words are, they're not yet bar das, which is why they're not yet bar or bas mitzvah, which will include that they're not obligated to go up. Now, there's a mitzvah of chinuch that we'll address in a moment.
The Riyah includes the Chagiga and the Simcha.
Yes, re'iyah, you're hearing the word oilas re'iyah. Re'iyah really means to appear. Right. When you have to appear, you have to come with oilas re'iyah and shalmei chagiga. There's so many nuances in this. If you remember, we learned in Beitza, machlekes b'shamei and b'silol, whether you are b'chlal allowed to offer oila on Yom Tov because no one is eating it. And we paskin that it was brought even on Yom Tov. And certainly the Shalmei Chagiga, who some of the meat is eaten by the Kahanim and by the Baalim, certainly they are brought on Yom Tov. Bottom line is, we're going to approach the Iyah means to appear with both of the sacrifices that you have to appear with in the beginning on the first day of Yom Tov. Okay.
I'm sorry, Rabbi. What is it? Tum? What is it?
We're not there yet. So
tum?
Now, like this, women, as we have in Kedushin Chavtes, women are exempt from all time-bound positive commandments. Exempt almost always doesn't mean that they can't do it. Actually, they could opt in, and when they opt in, they get the mitzvah, but they're not obligated. So now we have to speak about people whose gender is questioned. So in halacha, we have two genders, male and female. Then we have someone called a tumtum. A tumtum is a person whose genitalia is physically covered with a thick membrane of skin. With the advances of medicine or science as they had then, they were unable to determine what's under that membrane. They didn't know. A tumtum is either a male or a female, but we don't know what that person is. So such a person who has a suffix, whether male or female, they will be included in those who are exempt of appearing. Sometimes you say, if you have a doubt, be machmer. We'll learn in the Gemara all sources why indeed are they exempt. And androgynous is a person who has both the genitalia of a male and of a female. Now here there is a machlokes whether we view them as a third gender or whether we view them as male and female. It's not pure male. They are also exempt. Next, women. Avadim. Avadim means, like we mentioned in the beginning, a Eved that was born to a non-Jewish mother, who now belongs to a Jew, who underwent the mikvah l'shem avdus, she'eino mishuchradim, that's not yet emancipated. Because once an Eved Kanani becomes freed, since that person, if it's a man, already had a bris milah, as an Eved, they went to a mikvah for avdus. If they become emancipated, they become automatically full-fledged Jews. Then they're obligated to keep all of the commandments if they are male, like any other Jewish male. Yeira'eh kol zechurcha. Now, Chagiga, now we're going to go through people that are exempt of appearing in the temple because there's a physical infirmity. They can't, the gashmis, there's something wrong with them. So for example, Chagiga, someone who's lame. Now you can argue, big deal, carry the person into the Azara. We don't view it that way. The Torah calls these Yomim Tovim Regolim. There's many reasons, including Regel means feet. You have to be able to walk at least from Yerushalayim to Harabayas. Aside of the fact that many people would walk up the mountain to Yerushalayim, and that's really a walk. But if you're unable to walk because of something external, you are exempt from the obligation. So a lame person, we'll see soon why a blind person is exempt. Hachoila, someone who's ill. Vahazakin, not ill, just old. And also umi she'eno yachal alis b'raglav, any person who's unable to walk on his own with his feet from Yerushalayim to Harabayis to the Azara. You do the famous story of one of the Hasidim of the Alter Rebbe that always would visit the Alter Rebbe for Yom Tov. And by the way, halachically, many are of the opinion that when there isn't yet a third temple, the way we fulfill the mitzvah of Aliyas Haregel, appearing, is going to your Rebbe for Yom Tov. This is a halachic concept. And such a chassid would always walk from his village to the Alter Rebbe in Liyazna or Liyadi by foot. When he got very old, he was unable to walk. So the Hasidim offered to give him a ride. They had a horse and carriage. He said, absolutely not. He says that he felt that the only pure mitzvah he did in his life was going to his Rebbe for Yom Tov. He says when he's going to come into the next world and God is going to want to reward him, he doesn't want to be rewarded together with the horse that took him. If he has to stand together with a ferd, he doesn't want to stand there at all. In other words, you have to go with your feet.
But is Sheinu Yachol not subsumed in Chigir at Fola? Is it?
It's not subsumed, and the Gemara is going to go into questions always like Yadua, what exactly are we talking about? Now, what's a minor? Let me define the challenge of a minor. We all know that minors are not obligated to keep mitzvahs, but there is an obligation of chinuch, which is a huge topic. Upon whom is the obligation of chinuch? Rashi in Chagiga says explicitly the obligation of chinuch is on the father and on the mother. So hold on. Of course, a minor is not obligated. He's not obligated in anything, but there is a chinuch aspect. So the Mishnah clarifies that what's the katan who is exempt in the mitzvah of re'iyah, there isn't even chinuch. That's only kol she'enu yachal lirkav al kasef of shel aviv. He's even unable to ride on his father's shoulders and to go from Yerushalayim to Harabayis. These are the words of Bishamai. The moment a child is able to ride on the shoulders, see, there's something called taf. Taf means infant, something called a minor. That's the cutoff, according to Beishamai. If he's not even able to sit on the shoulder, that's called an infant. There's no mitzvah of chinuch yet when it comes to going to the Beis Hamikdash. Once the child reaches the level that they are able to sit on the father's shoulders, then mitzat chinuch, then there is an obligation to bring him. Beis Hillel has a little bit of an older age. A child who's unable to hold on to his father's hands and to walk from Yerushalayim to Harabayas, he is able to ride on the shoulders, but he's not old enough yet to walk, which makes a lot of sense. Because what's mitzvah chinuch? The mitzvah of chinuch is to begin to train a child to do something now, that which he will do as a bar or bas mitzvah, as a obligated full-fledged Jew. If he's not walking now to Yerushalayim, so where's the chinuch? If the mitzvah is to walk with your feet, when you become old, it's not about whether you can ride on someone's shoulders. It's whether you can walk. Says Beis Hillel, if you can't walk yet, who cares if you are already old enough to ride on the shoulders? Okay. And we'll have a moment. We're going to go back to the Rebbe, to a Sikha, and look at the Sikh's Chelik Tezayin, which the Rebbe will explain the underlining Machloikas B'Shamai and B'Silul, number one. The second B'Shamai and B'Silul that we'll have in a moment, and the Siyum of Chagiga, if we'll have time, we'll come back to it at the end of this year. Okay. Shenemar, as it says, Sholosh Regolim, from where we see that the emphasis, Yakir, is Regel, to walk. So again, if he's not of the age that he's able to walk, then there is B'chlal no Chiyuv of Chinuch. That's the big question. If a child is going to be eating on Yom Kippur, do you make Kiddush? It's the same question. Now, a child is not obligated to make Kiddush ever. Why would you make Kiddush? Because of Chinuch. Doesn't make sense, because when the child will become Bar Mitzvah, he'll never eat on Yom Kippur, you'll never make Kiddush. In other words, is there an inyan to do something as a cotton mitzat chinuch, which is exactly what you're doing, will never happen as an adult. Now, my example is not the best example, because even as an adult, if an adult is exempt from fasting and obligated to eat, right, then they make Kiddush. So it's shayach to make Kiddush for a meal on Yom Kippur. Masha'en came here, it's not shayach at all. The mitzvah of aliyas horegel is to walk with your feet from Yerushalayim on the beautiful ramps that they made onto the Harabayas, which really means the Azar. Now that we spoke about the Re'iyah, now that Tosfos even clarified in Rashi, Re'iyah doesn't only mean to appear in the temple courtyard. Re'iyah means to appear with the sacrifices, and we're going to focus now on the two sacrifices that you brought in the beginning, because there are 3 karbanos, but the shlamim of Simcha are in the place of when you ran out of Chagiga, now you add Karbanos Shalmei Simcha. But on the first day, and we paskin like B'Silul, but you bring it on the first day, you have 2 Karbanos, Oilo and Shlomo. It's amazing that when it comes to the halachas of Kachin, there are certain sacrifices that have no minimum value. The Torah doesn't specify, not the written Torah, not the oral Torah, not even the Rabbanon. Buy whatever you can buy it for. There are certain sacrifices that need to have a minimum value. When it comes to the Shalmei Simcha, there isn't even rabbinically a minimum value. When it comes to the first 2, Oilas Re'iyah and Shalmei Chagiga, they have to have a minimum value. And we're going to have a very interesting machloikas between Beis Shammai and B'Silul, which one has to be worth more than the other. Now, before you read it inside, what do you think? A oila, korban oila, is an animal that's fully burnt on the altar. There's only one achila. Only God consumes it, if we can use those words. Chazal use those words. A korban chagiga, a korban shlamim, is eaten by Hashem and by the Jewish people. Kahanim and then the Baalim. So which one would you think needs to be more valuable? Normally, if it's more valuable, there's more meat. So you would think that a shlamim, because there are more consumers. Yet there's a machlekes Beis Shammai and B'Silul. Again, we'll come to the end of the class. We'll come back to a sikha, God willing, where the Rebbe uses this as a great insight as to the thinking of Beis Shammai, which will make him consistent with the first argument regarding the minor, even not being able to walk, only able to ride on the father's shoulders is obligated.
Is Hillel being more machmir?
Here, there's no machmir. In the first case, he's being more lenient because he's putting the age of the minor older. That's called more lenient, only from a later age. Here, you can't say more lenient or more machmir, David, because it's just which one has to be more valuable. I got to bring both. I'm not saving money according to anyone. Question is, which one has to be the more that's more valuable? So let's read it inside. Beis Shammai, the school of Beis Shammai says, Hara'iyah, which is the korban oila, has to have rabbinically the value of 2 kesef. Now, kesef, we know kesef means kesef. Kesef means silver. In the times of Chazal, there was a name of a coin that's called a ma'ah. Mem ayin hey. A ma'ah was a 1/6 of a dinar. 2 kesef means a 1/3 of a dinar. Okay, these were currencies that people were familiar with them. 2 ma'ah, minimum. The chagiga, which is a shlamim, which isn't only burnt on the altar, but some of it is also consumed by the kohen and by the owners, only 1 ma'ah. Interestingly, according to Beis Shammai, which animal has to have more, even gashmi is the value, the oila. The chagiga, the shalmei chagiga, half, only 1 ma'ah kesef. And B'Silul Oimrim, In Yiddish, Punkt verkehrt, the opposite. Hariya ma kesef and Chagiga shtei kesef. We'll come back to that. Machlokes. And please remind me. Okay, says the Gemara. You have to understand that when Rabbeinu Hakadosh, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, when he formulated the Mishnah, even though these are words that were used forever, so whenever you open up a topic by using the words hakoil, all, and then you are including something beyond what you think. That's the rule. That's the way we interpret the formulation of the Mishnah. So the Gemara begins. It's a very common opening. The first word in the Mishnah, the first word in the Masechta is hakoil la'asuye mai. What are we including? In other words, there must be a case where one will think, is that person obligated? Is that person not obligated? And Rebbe is hinting, even that person is obligated. Who is that person that's obligated in the mitzvah of the Iyas HaRegel? So approach number one is la'asuye misha chetzyoy eved b'chetzyo ben choyim. A person who's half slave, half free. Like we mentioned, there was an Eved Kanani who belonged to a father who passed away, 2 sons, each one inherits half, or 2 partners bought an Eved Kanani. One of the owners emancipated the Eved. The Mishnah says that an Eved, before being emancipated, is not obligated. It's a time-bound mitzvah. Here, half, so to say, half is free, half is an Eved. So you would think maybe they are exempt. So the Mishnah say, even since there is a chatzi, half of this person is a bona fide free man, so then he has to go, even though he's taking the other half with him. Problem is that in 2 daf, not on Gimel, but on daf Dalid, Ravina will clearly explain a Mishnah by saying, Misha chetzye eved b'chetzye ben choyim patur ben hariyah. And we don't want to interpret the Mishnah in a way that we are going into a machlokes, or at least how will Ravina interpret hakoil? And by the way, we're going to come back to this. Let's first move on. Hakoil la'asuye mai la'asuye chiged b'yom rishon. Another phenomenal concept. You know, the openings of Masechtas, they lay a certain framework or groundwork that's foundational. There is a din called tashlumin. Tashlumin means compensation payment. Tashlumin means, just for example, if you loaned me money and the due date was yesterday and I didn't pay, doesn't mean that since I didn't pay, I'm off the hook. Today, I got to do tashlumin. Tashlumin means I got to compensate something that should have been done before. In most cases, sometimes there's not a penalty. By money, we can't because that's interest, but you pay later. We are obligated to bring on the first day of Yom Tov, let's begin with 2 sacrifices. Oilas Re'iyah, a korban that's fully burnt on the altar, which is connected to the mitzvah of Re'iyah, of us appearing in the temple courtyard, and a Shalmei Chagiga, korban shlamim connected to the Chag. These are 2 korbanos. When? Ideally on the first day. If one did not bring it on the first day, what happens then? We don't say like Erev Pesach, you missed a korban Pesach, Shalom, Pesach Sheni, at best. No, here we say that during Yom Tov, you can compensate for it. Not only during the Yom Tov of Pesach, not only during the Yom Tov of Shavuos, but we just learned in the previous Masechta, not only in Sukkos, but even Shavuos, that is only biblically a 1-day holiday, the subsequent 6 days, total again of 7 days, are days of Tashlumin. Now, there are 2 foundational ways, different one of the other, of how to view Tashlumin. Option number 1, the obligation is on day 1. If I didn't bring it on day 1, when I'm bringing it on day 2, or on day 3, or on day 4, what obligation am I fulfilling? The obligation of day 1. The obligation is 1. I get to fulfill it later. There's another way of viewing compensation. If I didn't pay my dues on day 1, that obligation is carried over to day 2. Now the obligation is the obligation of day 2. And if I don't do it on day 2, now it becomes a new obligation of day 3. What difference does it make one way or the other? Huge. What happens if someone is exempt on day 1? For example, they're lame, just one example. And then they got healed. And on day 2, they're no longer lame. If we view every day as the tashlumin of day 1, the person was lame. They'll never be obligated. If we say that if I didn't do it on day 1, the obligation gets carried over, and now it becomes a new obligation of day 2, then one can argue if now on day 2 the person is not lame, they have to bring it. Oh, so the Gemara says that this comes to include if someone was lame by Yom Rishon, and then v'nispashet. V'nispashet means he got extended. It means he got healed. Whatever the lameness was, the bone got healed by Yom Hasheni. So the Mishnah is telling you this person is obligated to bring on the second day or on the third day. They're obligated to appear with the sacrifices. So the Gemara says, well, that answer only fits according to the opinion that holds Kulan Tashlumin Zelozeh, which is what we explained as option number 2. In other words, each day is a fulfillment of itself. The obligation gets carried over and it becomes a new day 2 obligation, a new day 3 obligation. But according to the one who opines that the way we interpret this concept of paying later, of fulfilling your obligation at a later date, the obligation is only of day number 1. You are given a later date in which to fulfill it, but it's the obligation of day number 1. If a person the person was lame on day number 1. Very similar. What happens if you become bar mitzvah during Yom Tov? The same concept. Are you obligated? If every day is like a new obligation, so if you become bar mitzvah on day number 3, now on day number 3, bring your korbanos. If it's all tashlum and addition, you were pre-bar mitzvah before. It's similar. So again, hakoil asu emai. So the Gemara says, the word hakoil is coming to include another case, and that is suma ba'achas me'enov. The Mishnah said explicitly that if someone, God forbid, is blind, the Mishnah said they are exempt, right, of fulfilling the mitzvah of Re'iyah. What happens if someone is blind in one eye? Now, why is Bachal a blind person exempt? We'll get there, we'll get in the Gemara. But let me speak about blind in one eye. Now listen to these words. The Torah says in Parshas Mishpatim and in other places, Shalosh pa'amim bashana, and whoever knows Chitas or Zabal Kaida, the Torah is read Yeira'eh. Yeira'eh is pronounced with a tzedei under the yud, with a kametz under the reish, Yeira'eh. The letters are yud reish aleph hey. They could be read Yir'eh. Yir'eh, Yeira'eh. There are many, the Torah has no vowels. Now there is what we call the Mesoiris. The Mesoiris means the tradition of how the word should be written letters-wise, not how it should be pronounced, how it should be written. We have the Mesoiris. In every Sefer Torah, you're going to have the letters Yud, Reish, Aleph, Hey. But then there is what we call the Mikra. The Mikra means how God told Moshe, how Moshe taught our grandparents, how our grandparents told us how to pronounce it, how to read it. And it's interesting that there are many teachings in the oral Torah that will expound and juxtapose, in our case, that we want for there to be a match between the pronounced and between the written, even though it's only pronounced Yeira'eh. But we'll explain in a moment what Yira means, what Yeira'eh means. We'll read it inside and we'll see why there is an issue with someone who's blind in one of his eyes. So says the Gemara that if our Mishnah's Hakoil is coming to include someone who's blind in one of his eyes, that they are obligated, then you shall know our Mishnah won't be a unanimous opinion. There'll be those who argue with the Mishnah, which happens, Machlekes Tanoim, Udeloike Haitana, the Tanya, Yochanan ben Dahavoi Oimer, in the name of the great Rabbi Yehuda, that if a person is blind in one of his eyes, actually that person is exempt from the mitzvah of appearing with the sacrifices. Not they have to appear, not they have to bring the sacrifices. Why? Because Shenemar, now the first time the Gemara writes these words, we're going to pronounce it not the way Moshe Rabbeinu told us to pronounce it. Yira is called the Mesoiris. Mesoiris means, I know it means tradition. Mesoiris means the way it's written. The way it's written. It says Yira, but we know from the Mikra that it should be pronounced Yeira'eh. Yeira'eh. Okay, so what does that mean? So here we go. Yira means all kol zechorcha. What's kol zechorcha? All menfold. All men. What does Yira mean? Who knows Lashon HaKodesh?
We'll see.
Shall see. Shall see who? Shall see God. All men shall see God. What does Yeira'eh mean? All men shall be seen by God. Now, of course, God forbid to attribute physical characteristics to God. God doesn't have physical eyes. But as we learn, especially in Hasidus, that Adam Ha'elyon, that in the world of Atzilus, that there is the Partzuf, there is a abstract, ruchniistic form of godliness. And actually, the human physical form is Kitsalmenu Bidmuseinu. So we have two eyes because on a very subtle, ruchniistic level, not God. God has no form, absolute no form, not even a spiritual form. But godliness, Elikus, has a certain form from the world of Atzilus down, that we call the 10 spheres. In that ruchniistic parts of Atzilus, there are two eyes. So the fact that you can read it Yira, but we know to read it Yeira'eh, we're learning something from that. That the us seeing God should be equivalent to God seeing us. Now, when God looks at us, he kaviyachol looks at us with both of his eyes. God is not blind. So there is a Tana that says that if we cannot see God the way God sees us, we are exempt from the obligation. And this is so meaningful, even though we're learning this quickly. The two eyes mean a lot more than we think. And we know this from Hasidus. There is the right eye, there is the left eye, there is the compassionate, tolerant eye, that's the right eye, there is the judgmental eye, and life needs both. Life needs both. Of course, that the right eye should be stronger than the left eye. But people should not think that if you never use the left eye, you'll have a health. That's a person who's blind. Many people are blind in one of their eyes. God has the perfect balance. He knows when to be compassionate. He knows when to be judgmental. And by the way, judgmentalism doesn't mean that God won't be compassionate. After the left, there's rachamim. So it says this Tana, kederech shebalirois. Now this statement, according to Rashi, is referring to God. Who appears in the temple? Who appears in the temple? What would you answer? We do. That's not the full answer. You know who else appears in the Beis Hamikdash? God. God commands us that which he himself fulfills. God is commanding us to appear. That's because God appears. Now the next line is in reference to God. Kederech shebalirois, that's the way Rashi interprets, just like God is coming to see who? To see us. God is coming to see us. Kach ba'leirois, God is coming also to be seen, which was amazing that in the Beis Hamikdash we would experience seeing godliness, but they have to be similar. Ma lirois, just like when God sees us, so to say, on a very subtle ruchniistic level, God sees us with both of God's eyes. So also, af leirois, God who wants to be seen, the obligation is to be seen by people who have two eyes. Pishtei Einov. So that this Tana holds, Yechon the Navai holds, a person who's summa ba'achas me'enov, my friends, is exempt. Says our Mishnah, the first line, everyone is obligated, even if you're blind in one eye. Not like Rabbi Yechon the Navai. Now the Ibo is saying, not to make our Mishnah a machloikas tanoim, really we're going back to the first answer. The hakoil is coming to include chatzi evet, chatzi ben choyden. Now, listen to these words. There is a machloikas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, as we'll read in a moment. What should happen to this person? What's the problem? The problem is that this person who's half free and half slave, financially, there's no problem. One day he works for himself, one day he works for his master. It's easy to resolve the financial challenge, half-half. But this person may not marry anyone. A Jew may never marry, God forbid, a non-Jew. Not even a shivcha that belongs to a Yid. An Evet Kanani cannot marry a Jew. So each half disallows the other half to get married. Living outside of marriage for a man is prohibited. So ultimately, at a later time, Beis Shammai conceded to Beis Hillel conceded to Beis Shammai, not in the beginning, that the master is obligated to free the half that he owns. And by the way, that's not so simple, because if one were to be a half a slave, likelihood is they have no finances, they don't have a bank account. You forcing the master to free them, what about the value? So this person writes an IOU for whatever that's worth. Once Beis Hillel at a later time agreed to Beis Shammai that we force the master to free this person, even prior to the owner freeing, we view the slave as fully freed. Because since halacha obligates something to happen, we can view it as if it already happened. So at a later time, Once Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai that this person has to be freed, he will be a full-fledged free person. Even prior to that moment, he's obligated to go to the Beis Hamikdash because we already view him as a bona fide free person prior to Beis Hillel's consent to Beis Shammai. When Beis Hillel still felt that that person can remain the way they are, that's Daf Dalid, that's Ravina. At that point, they're not obligated to go to the Beis Hamikdash because they're half avodim. Let's read it. Kan is not Daf Beis. It's ironic. Kan is on Daf Dalid. Kan means later. Ravina, the Mishnah Rishayna, prior to Beis Hillel agreeing to Beis Shammai. And indeed, the Beis Hillel holds, as we quoted from Ravina, that whoever is a chetzi evet chetzi ben chayrim is patur min hara'iyah. But Kan, our Mishnah on Daf Beis, is Kamishna Achroinam, as we'll read right now. Ditnan, Misha chetzi evet chetzi ben chayrim. What do you do with this person? Financially, I got a simple resolution. One day he works for his master, and one day one day he works for himself. These are the words of Beis Hillel. The school of Beis Shammai tells Beis Hillel that Beis and Beis, my friends, tikantem es rabbi. You remedied. Really, rabbi means the master, but it's a financial remedy. Finances are easy to remedy. You make a compromise. Obviously, not everyone is even willing to make a compromise, but finances are the easiest area in halacha to remedy. But ves atzmai leitikantem. Ves atzmai means, what should that person do? He can't get married. Lisa Shifcha, to marry a woman that's not a full-fledged free Jewish woman, he's not allowed to because he's a chatzi evet. Lisa Bas Chodim, to marry a free Jewish woman, ain't a yachal, you can't because he's a chatzi evet. Now, there's so much to speak about, but we don't have time just to bring out. Tosfos ask a question. Why not? Why not find a woman who's a chatzi shivcha, chatzi bas chodim? And that's a very big thing that has to be resolved. But we don't allow that to happen. So libatul. So he won't get married. No, because the whole world was created for us to procreate. Now, someone will tell you that, and they will ask you for a scriptural source. What would you quote? You would quote Genesis. And the Gemara doesn't quote Puravu. The Gemara goes to a pasuk in Yeshaya. Shenema, because it says that Loi Toyu Bara, God didn't create the world for it to remain desolate. Not for that. What for? L'sheves Yitzhara. God wants the whole world to be populated. We are pro. There are 8 billion people. We want for the world to have 16 billion people. We want for the world to have as many people as will be born. That's what God wants. And there's a whole question over here. Why don't we quote the Pru Uravu? I just want to give you from the many insights. There are many mitzvahs that one is unable to keep. Now, how do we view a scenario where you are unable to keep it? So I'll tell you, certain mitzvahs are primarily a mitzvah on the person. I have to do something. And if I'm unable, okay, so then there's no mitzvah. I'm unable. There are many mitzvahs that are result-oriented. Let's go, not action or result-oriented. Pru Uravu is not result-oriented. Many great tzaddikim, they got married, and they had no children. Many people that we know don't have the halachic Pru Uravu. They don't have a son and a daughter. They can have 20 daughters or 20 sons. They didn't do Pru Uravu. They can have a son and a daughter, but they don't have grandkids with all of the details when you fulfill the obligation. If a person was busied with Pru Uravu, they fulfilled Pru Uravu. In other words, Pru Uravu, the biblical commandment, is not result-oriented. It's action-oriented. As long as you choose to get married. I'll tell you more. If a person is looking to get married and they don't find their shidduch, if they were making an effort in their life to get married, they were fulfilling Pru Uravu. Just like a married couple who were trying to have children. They were oisik the Pru Uravu. This Yeshaya, is not an action-oriented mitzvah. This is a result-oriented mitzvah. We got to have kids. The world has to be populated. Here, claiming that I did my best, but I couldn't, is not going to be an excuse. So this person has a problem. Ella says, you force the master to free him. This person claims, ainly, say that, let him write a IOU. And that is what Beis Shammai held. Now, at some point, so that resolves our Mishnah, even according to Ravina, that says on Daf Dalet correctly, that Beis Hillel at a time held Chatzi Evet, Chatzi ben Chodim is patur min hara'iyah. After Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai, that's the concept. once the master is mechuyev to free that half, we view that person as if he is already fully freed, not regarding marriage, regarding this mitzvah. That's the hakoil. Mishnah says, chutz michedesh shoyte v'katan. So the concluding of today's daf will be clarifying the chedesh. The chedesh means the deaf mute. Says the Gemara that since the Mishnah joins the three together, chedesh, shoyte v'katan. Now we know shoyte means someone who's mentally deranged. Katan is someone who's not yet old enough to have a developed intelligence. So chedesh is part of that. The issue with the chedesh, right? Not that they are infirm or blind. What's the issue? We'll see later. But chedesh is because they're not considered halachically people that are fully mentally developed. Katani chedesh the fact that the Mishnah puts them all three together, just like we know clearly that the shoyte, the definition of a shoyte, the definition of a katan is the lav b'nei. They are people that are not fully mentally competent. Af chedesh, the disqualification or the exemption that's given to the chedesh is because this is a person that's viewed the lav b'nei deyahu. Okay, and v'komash malan, and now that we interpreted that the issue of chedesh is about mental competence, so now the Mishnah by implication is consistent with a explicit Mishnah in Mesechtas Terumos. Now here we are also using the word chedesh. We said in the intro that the word chedesh could be used even for a person who is deaf. In our Mishnah, chedesh means deaf mute. So let's read inside the Mishnah in Terumos. Chedesh shedibru chacham b'chol makom, says the Mishnah, whenever the sages say the word chedesh and they don't clarify what type of chedesh, they are specifically speaking about a person who has both challenges, she'enoi shemeya and ve'enoi medaber. And we understand that, again, I know that now, let me just speak out, that the Beis Shloima and the Divrei Chaim and the Maharsham, these are the great halachic decisors already from the previous generations. Now we are way more advanced. Even then, we're going back 200 years or less, they already held that in their days, a deaf mute is no longer exempt of the mitzvahs because we figured out how to communicate with them and how to teach them communicate with us. But prior to that, they were outcasts. No one spoke to them. No one communicated with them. If a person never speaks or is never spoken to, they mamish don't develop. We should understand that the more socially engaged the person is, the more they are mentally developed. The more isolated the person is, the less they develop. And if a person is completely isolated, they remain completely handicapped mentally. Okay, so the Mishnah says that chedesh, which is exempt of all of the commandments, is someone that cannot hear and not speak, which means hamadaber ve'enu shemeya, but if he can speak, even though he can't hear, or if he can hear, even though he can't speak, yes, chayiv. And now you should know, tanina lo tana rabbanan. So that which we learned in the Mishnah, by implication over here, because chedesh, shoyte v'katan are grouped together. The Mishnah explicitly in Teruma. That's something that's even further developed in a Braisa. The word Braisa means the works of the Tanoim that were not included in Mishnah. Braisa means outside. They are normally introduced by the Gemara saying Tanina or Tanya or Tanu Rabbanan. And normally Braisas are more elaborate. And indeed, like from our Mishnah, it's only implied. The fact that chedesh shoyte v'katan, but this is clearly spelled out even more in the following Braisa, where it says, Hamadaber ve'enu shemeya. Now here, you see, once you go into greater details, you can use the word chedesh more often, but you have to clarify. If someone speaks, but they are, that's called deaf, right? That's called the chedesh. That could be called a chedesh. Now, again, not always. In details, that's also a chedesh. Shemeya ve'enu medaber. Someone who can hear, but they can't speak, the only infirmity is they are mute. That's in details called a ilaim. And the Braisa says, Zeh v'zeh hareyem kepikchen l'chol devareim. Pikeyach in the similar, or pikchin in the plural means someone who's intelligent in the context, not of IQ, of them being obligated to keep the mitzvahs, both a man and a woman once they reach the age of. Okay, now, says the Gemara, this is a question more on semantics. Umimai de medaber ve'enu shemeya zeu chedesh, shemeya ve'enu medaber zeu ilaim. Where do we find an allusion in Scripture that we could use the word chedesh even to someone who is able, right, to speak, as long as they can't hear. You also use the term. From where do we see that the word Elaim is used for someone who can hear, and their only challenge is that they cannot speak? We find that in a pasuk in Tehillim, where it says, "Befedish, va'ani kechedesh." What does it say? Only loy eshma. Not I'm like a chedesh who cannot hear and speak. Loy eshma. Uche which is loy yiftach piv. The Iboy is saying that the word Elaim is a composite of the words in Aramaic of Kedamri Inchi, Ishtakel Milule. Ishtakel Milule literally means, Milul means Melila, speech. His speech was taken away. And you think about it, that Ishtakel, the word Ishtakel, when you want to analyze a word, this is a very important klal. What is the most important letter of a word? The first letter. What's the second most important letter of a word? The last letter, and then comes the in-between, the milui. So look at the word ishtakel. Ishtakel means removed in Aramaic. Milui means, ishtakel begins with an aleph and it ends with a lamed. So you have aleph, lamed. The word milule begins with a mem. That's Elaim. What's Elaim, even Elaim, aside of the pasuk in Tehillim, it's an abbreviated ishtakel milule. Now, we learned in the Mishnah and Terumas, medaber ve'ena shemeya. Or Shemein and Adaber, you're chayv in all the mitzvahs. Whoa, but we got a contradiction. But we learned in a Braisa, Adaber and Shemein and Adaber, they are exempt from Re'iyah. Now, Re'iyah, which is our topic, is one of the mitzvahs. So how do you reconcile that? And the Gemara says that you should know we have to add in between the line and the Mishnah. Really, you have this super chedesh, can't hear, can't speak. You have this partial chedesh. Both of them have some exemption. The greater the challenge, the greater the exemption. And let's unpackage this. Amar Avina, or the answer is given by Rava that really you have to add, you have to see in between the lines in the Mishnah. So let's go. Now we are repeating the words in the Mishnah, but we're opening up. We're giving it a lot more detail. The Mishnah begins Hakoil Chayovim B'Re'iyah. The Mishnah is speaking about Re'iyah, and now we're going to add the word Simcha. Now it's very important. Simcha, like we mentioned, really there are three karbanos. Oilas Re'iyah, Shalmei Chagiga, Shalmei Simcha. Oilas Re'iyah, Shalmei Chagiga are karbanos that every male is obligated to bring when they go up. When the meat of the Shalmei Chagiga runs out, because of the fact that it says V'samachta b'chagecha, which includes eating sacrificial meat, then you bring other shlamim, that's called Shalmei Simcha. The Gemara here is not speaking about Chagiga, and I'll quickly quote a Tosfos in a moment. But let's first read inside. We are comparing now, Re'iyah means Oilas Re'iyah, Simcha means Shalmei Simcha, the last one that we mentioned. So really, everyone is obligated to bring Re'iyah, everyone is obligated to bring Simcha. Let's first speak about, let's say, the minimum type of chedesh. Someone whose infirmity is only that they are deaf. They can speak but not hear. Or, you know what? Chedesh also means shemei ve'ena medaber, which is called an Elaim. They have some exemption. But you know what they are exempt of? They are exempt from oilas re'iyah. From oilas, they are exempt from oilas re'iyah. They are chayiv and simcha. Tosfos 2 lines before the bottom of the Amud adds that they are also chayiv and chagiga. Now, what did we learn in Amud Aleph, Ariel? You know, there's seeing God, being seen by God. We have to be more God-like. Like we had that question, like if we're blind in one eye, if we're not exactly the way God. But when it comes to rejoicing, I think that's a beautiful moral lesson. The little good that we have, we should rejoice for. Even if there's some infirmity, you can either say, oh my God, I'm not perfect, or epis, I can't speak, I can hear. I can't hear, but I can speak. So simcha you're chayivin. So if a person, let's say, is the minimum chedesh, they have some exemption. They are exempt from the oilas re'iyah. But, right, the first wide line, 4 lines before the bottom of the amid, but someone who is complete deaf mute, they are already considered people who are mentally not developed, and a shaita, however that's defined, and a minor, they are even exempt from the Shalmei Simcha. And indeed, we learned that explicitly in the Braisa, where it says Hakol chayavim, both in the Iyah and in Simcha. Chutz mechedesh hamadaber ve'ein shemeya, or shemeya ve'ein medaber, that they are exempt from the Iyah. Now we're going to learn in tomorrow's daf scriptural sources, like why. I mean, we gave a nice title, but they are exempt from Oilas Re'iyah. And V'afal Pi Shepatur Min Re'iyah, they are daf gimel, they are chayiv b'simcha. But that's because the person is only a minimal chedesh. But once you have the bona fide chedesh, which is both deaf and yud, the eshe ein l'shmei v'lo medaber, and the shota and shoita and the cotton, they are paturim. Af min hasimcha, they not only are they exempted from oilas re'iyah, but they are also exempted from shalmei simcha. And according to Tosfos, they are also exempted from shalmei chagiga. Why? Because a deaf mute is exempt from all of the commandments. They are exempt and not obligated. Hoyel upeturim mikol mitzvahs hu amurais batoira. Now I want to go back just to quote the Lakutei Sichos Chelik Tezayin. Truma Dalit is a phenomenal sicha. It's a very long sicha where the Rebbe speaks about the underlying foundation, which explains all of the arguments between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And in that sicha, the Rebbe is really making a siyum on Chagiga. And when the Rebbe makes a siyum, many times he connects the end of Chagiga to the beginning. And in the beginning of Chagiga, we have two arguments, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, as we had in the Mishnah. And let's go into both of them. So here's the thing when it comes, let's speak about karbonos. Let's go to the second explicit machlekes in the Mishnah about which one should have more value. When you look at something, do you look at its root or do you look as it's developed? Beis Shammai always look at its root. It looks at the core. Beis Shammai goes a lot deeper. When you are gevuradik, you always go deeper. You can only be chesed when you're more superficial. Sometimes that's the way you got to be. But when you analyze your brain, in the root, all karbanos are given to God. It doesn't make a difference whether I will eat it, whether Kohen will eat it, whether I won't eat it. It's an offering to God. The way it's externalized is that certain karbanos are taka fully burnt on the altar. So it's done externally. It expresses what it really is. And certain karbanos, it's already difficult to notice that because the moment I get to eat from the carbon, it almost looks like it's a little bit of a selfish activity. Some to God, some to me. Beis Shammai considers if something, even as it's developed, is still purely mirroring its root, it's more potent, it's more chashuv. So dafke the oila, that even begashmius, all of it is burnt on the altar, it's clear that a carbon means I'm doing an act for God. Because that's what a carbon is. It's a pure act for God. Even the eating of the kohen is for God. Even the eating of the owners, the way it should be, is for God. According to Beis Hillel, looks at the things the way they are, so to say, more on its external level, which is good and bad. It's not about good; it's a different approach. So, on an external level, a shlamim is more developed than the oila because the oila is only given to God. The shlamim is given to both. That's why Beis Hillel is the one that holds that the shlamim has to have more value. The Rebbe says the same thing when it comes to chinuch. Externally, when as a child, you can argue the mitzvah is to walk from Yerushalayim to Harabais. So if the child cannot walk yet, he's not old enough to do the mitzvah. Why would Beis Hillel say? Why? So Beis Hillel says there's no mitzvah of chinuch. Beis Shammai sees in a child, even though the child externally cannot walk yet, the moment the child is old enough to ride on the father's shoulders, he's no longer an infant. He already in potential. We all have young children, or we have young children. You know that moment when they are about to walk. Beis Shammai sees the root. He's about to walk. He's already walking. He doesn't need for things to fully express themselves. The koyach, the potential of walking, you already find in a child as long as he's riding on his father's shoulders. So from then you're chayv in the mitzvah of chinuch. Gavaldik. We'll leave it at that. God willing, to be continued.
What are we learning from this when it comes to the chinuch of the child?
What we learn from this when it comes to the chinuch of the child.
When we look at the child,
That when Mashiach will come, that we paskin like Beis Shammai. And I think when it comes especially to chinuch, don't look at what your child is doing. Look at what the child potential is. Now, that's what Beis Shammai does.
Rabbi, can you tie this into the menorah?
Sure. Because
Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel?
Beis Shammai, Danny's asking in the Masechta Shabbos, we have the machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, like the first night of Hanukkah, right? How many candles do you light? So when you look at the lamp, every lamp had that minimum amount of oil. That had the chatziloik. How much did the Chatziloig of the first light, how much power did it have in potential? Now that we know the story, it had enough to burn for 8 days. So the greatest miracle was in the beginning. It had the greatest potential, but it didn't happen yet. Beis Hillel only looks at the external. Only after the miracle happened do we celebrate the miracle. So the 8 days, 8 candles, because wow, it burned for 8 days. Beis Shammai already saw that potential on day number 1. Actually, the second night of Hanukkah, the oil only had potential for 7 days. It was less potential. So every day, according to Beis Shammai, you go down a candle. Fits.
Thank you, Rabbi. He also
Rabbi,
compares the
It's curious,
two
that why don't they
Bishvats.
just say you pay the same amount for the two korbanos?
Take away.